The plastic chair felt harder than usual, or maybe it was just the way Leo was sitting, perched on the edge like he was ready to run away at the slightest sound. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and floor wax, a scent that usually meant a boring Tuesday night, but tonight the air felt thick, charged with something mean. Leo kept his eyes fixed on a small scuff mark on the tile floor. It was shaped a bit like a tear, and staring at it was the only way to keep his composure. He was 22 years old, but looking at his slumped shoulders, you might have guessed he was 40. The weight he was carrying wasn't physical, though he was thin and tired-looking. It was a kind of weight that presses down on your chest when you open an envelope and see numbers that are higher than you can count. It was the debt. It wasn't just a few missed payments. It was a mountain of them, piled up from months of hospital bills, medicine, and a desperate attempt to keep a roof over his mother's head before she passed away. Now she was gone, and the mountain was left entirely to him. Around him, the community hall was filling up. This was the monthly neighborhood meeting, a place where people usually came to complain about potholes or stray dogs. But today, the gossip mill had churned out a different topic. Everyone knew Leo was there. They knew he was going to ask for more time. They knew he was drowning. A group of men stood near the entrance, their voices low, but carrying easily in the echoey hall. "Did you see his car?" A heavy-set man in a flannel shirt whispered, not bothering to lower his voice much. "Piece of junk. If he spent half as much time working as he does making excuses, he wouldn't be in this mess." "He thinks the world owes him a living," another man added, shaking his head. "Borrowing money he can't pay back. It's people like him who ruin the property values for the rest of us." Leo didn't look up. He gripped the hem of his worn-out jacket. His knuckles were white. He wanted to stand up and scream that he worked 2 jobs, that he hadn't bought a new pair of shoes in 2 years, that he sold his television and his mother's jewelry just to buy food last week. But he knew it wouldn't matter. To them, he was just a bad statistic, a liability. The meeting was called to order by Mrs. Gable, a woman who ran the neighborhood association, with a clipboard and a frown. She looked over her glasses at Leo. "Item 4 on the agenda," she said, her voice crisp and impersonal. "The rent arrears of Unit 4B. Leo, do you have the payment?" Leo stood up slowly. His legs felt like they were made of lead. The room went quiet. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. Some looked curious, some looked annoyed, and some wore that familiar, tight-lipped expression of judgment. "No, Mrs. Gable," Leo said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to find the strength he didn't feel. "I don't have it all. I have half of it. I need 2 more weeks. My boss promised me extra hours for the holiday shift, and I can get the rest then." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It wasn't the happy kind of laughter. It was sharp and jagged. 2 weeks? A woman in the back called out. "I've been hearing that for 3 months. He's playing the violin again," someone else sneered. "Or maybe he needs to sell that car of his. Oh, wait, who would buy it?" The laughter grew a little louder. It was a pack mentality. When one person struck, the others felt safe to join in. It was easy to laugh at the boy in debt than to think about how scary it would be to be in his shoes. They saw his struggle as a moral failing, something that happened to lazy people, not to good neighbors. Leo felt his face burn hot. He could feel the sweat pricking on his forehead. He looked at Mrs. Gable, hoping for a shred of mercy, but her face was blank. She was just doing her job, she told herself. Rules were rules. "Lo, you know the policy," Mrs. Gable said, sighing. "If you can't pay, we have to start the eviction process. We can't have one person dragging everyone else down." "Drag us down?" the man in the flannel shirt shouted. "He's a leech. Get him out." The words hit Leo like physical blows. Leech, lazy, liar. They didn't know the nights he spent crying in the dark because the house was too quiet. They didn't know the terror of the phone ringing, knowing it was another collector. They only saw the debt. He stood there, frozen, while the murmurs turned into open chatter. People were checking their watches, looking bored, or exchanging smug glances. They had already decided his fate. To them, he was a problem to be removed, like a stain on the carpet. Leo looked around the room, searching for a friendly face. There wasn't one. He saw the woman who lived next door, the one he used to help carry her groceries up the steps. She was looking away, studying her fingernails. He saw the man whose flat tire he had changed last winter in the freezing cold. The man was whispering to his wife, a smirk on his face. Something inside Leo shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was a feeling of finality. The humiliation was total. He had begged, and he had been rejected. He had been stripped of his dignity in front of the people who were supposed to be his neighbors. There was nothing left to say. No words could fix this. He didn't bolt for the exit. That would look like defeat, like running away. Instead, he turned away from the center of the room. His eyes landed on the far corner of the stage. There, pushed against the wall and covered in a thin layer of dust, sat an old upright piano. It was a battered instrument, the finish scratched and faded. It hadn't been tuned in years. Usually, it was just used as a table to stack extra folding chairs or discarded coats. Tonight, it was bare, its keyboard exposed like a smile that had forgotten how to work. Leo walked toward it. The murmuring in the crowd continued for a moment, people confused by his movement. He wasn't leaving? What was he doing? Where's he going? Someone whispered. Probably to hide behind the curtain. Another voice answered, followed by a snicker. Leo reached the piano. He ran his fingers lightly over the dust, wiping it away, though it felt cool and solid under his touch. This was the only thing in the room that didn't feel judgmental. The piano didn't care about credit scores or bank accounts. It didn't care if he was rich or poor. It only cared about vibration, about touch, about feeling. He sat down on the bench. It creaked under his weight, a small sound in the large room. He was facing the corner, away from the staring eyes, but he knew they were all watching. He could feel their gaze burning into his back. They were waiting for him to break, to cry, or make a fool of himself in some new way. Leo took a deep breath. He let it out slowly, trying to calm the racing of his heart. He closed his eyes for a second and let the memory of the past few weeks wash over him. The fear, the loneliness, the crushing weight of the numbers. He let it all sit there in the pit of his stomach. And then he reached out and placed his hands on the keys. His fingers were rough and callous from working on engines, but they were also gentle. He knew this instrument. He knew it better than he knew how to talk to people. Music was the language he spoke when his own words failed him. Behind him, the crowd was getting restless. The mockery was starting to bubble up again. Look at him, pretending to be a musician now. A voice taunted. Hey, play us a sad song, Leo. Maybe it'll pay the rent. The laughter rose up again, trying to swallow him. But Leo didn't turn around. He didn't stop. He pressed down on the keys. A single, low note rang out, cutting through the noise. It was deep and resonant, surprising in its clarity. He began to play. The sound that came out of the old instrument wasn't perfect. It was a little tinny, and some of the higher keys buzzed slightly because the piano hadn't been tuned in years. But the first chord Leo struck was so heavy and so full of sadness that it seemed to suck the air right out of the room. It was a deep, resonant C minor chord that hung in the dusty air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. For a split second, the laughter didn't stop. The man in the flannel shirt, who had been smirking at his friend, let out one last loud guffaw, thinking the boy was just banging on the keys to make noise. But the chord didn't fade away like a joke. It sustained, vibrating to the floorboards and up the legs of the cheap plastic chairs. It felt serious. It felt dangerous. The smirk on the man's face faltered. He looked at the stage, confused. The noise wasn't chaotic. It was intentional. It had a shape to it. The people in the back row, who had been whispering amongst themselves, went quiet. The sound was too big to ignore. It demanded attention, not because it was loud, but because it was heavy with a feeling they couldn't quite name yet. Leo didn't turn around. He kept his back to the audience, his shoulders hunched forward. His eyes were closed, blocking out the sight of the peeling paint on the wall, focusing entirely on the feeling in his fingers. He knew this music. He had written parts of it in his head, while sitting on the edge of his mother's hospital bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. He had hummed the melody under his breath while walking home in the dark, wondering how he was going to buy groceries. He began to move his hands. The left hand anchored the song with a slow, rhythmic bass pattern. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat that was struggling to keep going. The right hand began to climb up the scale, playing notes that were crying out for help. It wasn't a happy tune. It wasn't a catchy pop song you could hum along to. It was a dark, winding melody that told the story of the last 6 months of his life. The silence in the room grew deeper. It wasn't just that people stopped talking. They stopped moving. The woman who had been checking her watch slowly lowered her wrist, her eyes drawn to the stage. The couple who had been whispering about their vacation plans turned their heads, their expressions blank. The music was crawling under their skin. Mrs. Gable, who had been shuffling her papers on the clipboard, froze. She looked up at the boy she had just scolded. She saw the way his head hung down, the way his back curved, and she heard the sound he was creating. It sounded like grief. It sounded like the way you feel when you are completely alone and the night won't end. As the song progressed, Leo's fingers started to move faster. The simple bass line began to get more complicated, weaving in and out like a tangled thread. The melody became frantic, jumping up the keyboard and then crashing back down. It was the sound of panic. It was the sound of opening a bill and realizing the numbers didn't add up. It was the sound of a phone ringing at 3 o'clock in the morning. The people in the chairs felt a strange tension in their chests. They had come to judge a boy who owed money, but now they were hearing what that debt felt like. They were feeling the weight of it. It wasn't just a number on a piece of paper anymore. It was this noise. It was this struggle. A young man sitting near the front, who had crossed his arms and looked ready to fight, suddenly uncrossed them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He watched Leo's hands. They were scarred and greasy, the hands of a mechanic, but they moved with a grace that seemed impossible. The fingers danced over the black and white keys with speed that made them blur. It was mesmerizing. It was like watching a bird try to fly out of a cage. The music swelled. Leo started pressing the keys harder, putting his entire body into the sound. He wasn't just playing notes. He was pushing his pain into the instrument. Every time he struck a chord, he was imagining the eviction notice. Every time he played a run of fast notes, he was imagining the laughter of the debt collectors. He was taking all the shame they had poured on him and throwing it back at them in the only language he had left. The mockery that had filled the room just minutes ago was completely gone now. It was impossible to laugh at this. The sound was too raw, too naked. If you laughed, you would be laughing at someone's heart breaking, and even the cruelest person in the room wasn't ready for that. Mr. Henderson, the older man who had made the joke about the sad song, sat very still. He had a granddaughter who played the violin. He knew how hard it was to make music, to make something out of silence. But this was different. This wasn't performance. It was a confession. He watched the boy's trembling shoulders and realized that the music was shaking him apart. The melody shifted again. It moved from the frantic, high-pitched panic into a slower, more mournful section. The notes became long and drawn out, singing to the ceiling. It sounded like a goodbye. It was the sound of Leo remembering his mother's voice, the sound of the empty apartment, the sound of the silence that drove him crazy. In the third row, a woman felt a sudden tear spill over her cheek and run down her face. She wiped it away quickly, annoyed with herself. She didn't even know this kid. Why did she care? But the music was tricking her. It was bypassing her brain and talking straight to her heart. We have all felt sad. We have all felt trapped. Everyone in that room had a moment where they didn't know how they were going to make it. Leo was playing that moment for all of them. He played a sequence of chords that rose up higher and higher, building a ladder sound that seemed to reach for the sky. It felt like hope, but a fragile kind of hope, a hope that could easily be crushed. The room held its collective breath. Everyone was waiting to see where the music would go. Would it collapse? Would it find a way out? Leo's hands were sweating, making the keys slippery, but he didn't stop. He was in a trance now. He couldn't hear the hum of the air conditioner anymore. He couldn't hear the rustling of clothes. He could only hear the song. It was the only thing that made sense. When he played, he wasn't the boy in debt. He wasn't a failure. He was a creator. He was powerful. The music began to weave together the sadness and the anger. It wasn't just oppressed anymore. It was fighting. The rhythm became stronger, like a pulse returning to a dying heart. The notes struck with conviction. It was the sound of someone saying, "I am still here. You haven't beaten me yet." The people in the audience felt that strength. They sat up a little straighter. The cynicism that had made them feel superior started to feel heavy and uncomfortable. They looked at the greasy jacket hanging on the boy's thin frame, and then they looked at the incredible talent pouring out his fingers. The contrast was shocking. They had judged the cover of the book so harshly, assuming the story inside was garbage. But now, the story was being read to them, and it was beautiful. The hall was so quiet now that you could hear the squeak of the piano bench as Leo shifted his weight. You could hear the soft thud of his foot working the sustain pedal. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with respect. Leo's hands moved toward the end of the piece. The tempo slowed down again, but the power was still there. He played a final series of deep, low notes that echoed like a gong in a temple. They resonated in everyone's chest. He struck the last chord, a complex, layered sound that was sad but somehow peaceful, and he held it. He pressed the keys down and didn't let go. The sound vibrated, filling the entire space, swirling around the dust motes in the light, wrapping around the people who had mocked him. It was a sound that forgave them, even though they didn't deserve it. It was a sound that asked for nothing but to be heard. And then his hands lifted off the keyboard. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. It wasn't the awkward silence before. It was a heavy, shocked silence. The air in the room felt completely changed. The dust motes seemed to hang suspended, frozen by the absence of sound. Leo sat there for a moment, his chest heaving up and down. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling from the exertion. He was terrified to turn around. He had poured his soul out, and now he didn't know if he would find mercy or rejection. He just stared at the music rack where no sheet music stood, waiting for the world to come back into focus. Leo sat on the bench, his back still turned to the crowd, listening to his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The last vibration of the piano string had faded into the air, but the feeling of the music seemed to linger, pressing against the walls of the room. He was terrified. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. It was a kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm, but without the wind. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the ridicule to start again. He expected a cough, a laugh, a cruel comment about his greasy hair or his old jacket. He thought they would tell him to get off the stage and go back to his problems. But the laughter didn't come. Slowly, the reality of what had just happened began to settle over the room. The people in the plastic chairs weren't looking at each other anymore. They weren't checking their phones or whispering about groceries. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on a thin, hunched figure sitting at the dusty piano. The barrier between them had shattered. It's hard to think of someone as a deadbeat loser when you just felt their soul bleeding out through a melody. In the third row, a woman named Nancy sat frozen. She had been one of the ones smirking earlier, happy to gossip about Leo's unpaid bills. But now, she felt a strange, tight sensation in her throat. She remembered how she used to play the flute when she was a teenager, how music used to be her escape before life got too busy and too hard. Hearing Leo play had unlocked a box in her own heart that she had taped shut years ago. She looked at his trembling shoulders and realized she wasn't seeing a beggar anymore. She was seeing a human being in pain. The music had translated his suffering into a language she understood fluently. It was a language of loss. Mr. Henderson, the older man who had made the joke about the sad song, felt his hands gripping his knees so hard his fingers ached. He stared at the back of Leo's head. The music had reminded him of his own son, a boy who had left town 10 years ago and never called. The notes Leo played had sounded exactly like the loneliness Mr. Henderson felt every night in his quiet house. He suddenly felt a deep sense of shame. He had kicked the boy while he was down just to feel a little bit taller himself. The beauty of the piano made him feel small, and not in a good way. It made him feel petty. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of thoughts. It was full of people reevaluating. They had looked at the numbers in Leo's bank account, but they had never looked at his heart. The piano had forced them to look. And what they saw was a young man who was drowning, but who was fighting to keep his head above water with every ounce of strength he had. That wasn't something to laugh at. That was something to respect. Leo couldn't stand the suspense anymore. He took a shaky breath and slowly turned around on the bench to face them. His face was pale, and there were tracks in the dust on his cheeks where tears had silently fallen while he was playing. He looked scared, like a wild animal that expects to be hit. He expected to see anger on their faces. Instead, he saw confusion. He scanned the room. The sneers were gone. The crossed arms had uncrossed. The people who had been leaning back in their chairs, looking bored, were now leaning forward. The atmosphere in the hall had completely flipped. Just 5 minutes ago, the air had been thick with judgment and hostility. Now it was heavy with empathy and regret. The judgment had been washed away by the flood of the music. It started with just one sound. In the front row, a little girl who had come with her parents clapped her hands together once. It was a soft sound, but it broke the spell. Then Nancy, the woman who had been smirking, began to clap. She didn't know why she did it, but she felt she had to do something. She couldn't just sit there. Her applause was slow at first, rhythmic and deliberate. Then Mr. Henderson joined in. He put his large, weathered hands together and started clapping. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a solid, heavy sound of approval. Within seconds, the room erupted. It wasn't just a polite round of applause for a neighbor. It was a wave of noise that crashed against the walls. People stood up. The man in the flannel shirt stood up, his face red, not with anger this time, but with embarrassment and emotion. He clapped until his palms stung. The chatter and the cruelty were buried under the sound of the appreciation. They were clapping for the music, yes, but mostly they were clapping for an apology they didn't know how to put into words. Leo sat there, stunned. He blinked rapidly, looking from face to face. He saw tears streaming down the cheeks of people he thought hated him. He saw smiles that were genuine, not mocking. The boy who had been invisible 5 minutes ago was suddenly the center of a universe. The change was so violent, so sudden that it made his head spin. He had never been looked at with such admiration. It was a foreign feeling. He stood up slowly. His legs felt weak, like jelly. He gave a small, awkward nod to the room. He didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed too small. I'm sorry for the debt seemed irrelevant. So he just stood there, letting their applause wash over him, feeling the warmth of it seep into his cold bones. For the first time in a year, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like he had value. The applause began to die down, settling back into a murmur, but the energy in the room was completely different now. It was softer. It was kinder. Mrs. Gable, the woman with the clipboard, stood up at the front table. She looked at the paper in her hand. Then at Leo, then back at the paper. She sighed loudly, and for the first time, the sound wasn't annoyed. It sounded like she was deflating. She looked tired of being the enforcer of the rules. Well, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She cleared her throat, looking around the room. I think we can table the eviction discussion for tonight. A few people murmured in agreement, nodding their heads. That was quite something, Leo, Mrs. Gable continued, taking off her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. I didn't know you could play like that. None of us did. Leo looked down at his shoes. I just play to feel better, he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the shuffling of feet. Well, it made us feel something, that's for sure, Mr. Henderson called out from the front row. His voice grumbled a bit, but the kindness was there. You got a gift, son, a real gift. People started to pack up their things, but the rush was gone. Nobody was running to the exit anymore. They were moving slower, lingering. As Leo walked down the 3 steps in the stage, a path opened up for him. It wasn't a path made of people moving away to avoid him. It was a space made for him to walk through. He headed toward the exit, his heart still pounding. He just wanted to go home and process what had happened. But as he reached the aisle, Nancy stepped into his path. She was older than him, maybe his mother's age. She looked nervous. "Lo," she said, "that was beautiful. Truly." He looked up, surprised. "Thanks, Nancy. I have an old keyboard at my house," she stammered, looking a bit embarrassed. "My grandson left it there. It's just gathering dust. I don't need it. Do you want it? It might be easier practice on than coming here all the time." Leo stared at her. She was offering him an instrument. She was offering him help. I don't have any money to pay you for it," he whispered. Nancy smiled, and it was a warm smile that reached her eyes. I don't want money, Leo. Just play for us again sometime. Okay. Leo felt a lump form in his throat, so big he couldn't speak. He just nodded. He walked a few more feet, and Mr. Henderson stopped him. The older man reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. He didn't hand it to Leo like charity. He held out like a payment. For the song, Mr. Henderson said gruffly. Best entertainment I've had at this meeting in 20 years. I can't take this, Leo said, putting his hands up. You hate the debt collectors. You don't owe me anything. I don't hate you, kid. I hate being broke, just like you, Mr. Henderson said, shoving the bill into Leo's hand. Take it. Buy yourself some dinner. And look, if you need help fixing that car of yours so you can get to that extra shift, come find me. I'm good with engines. Leo looked at the bill in his hand, then at the man's face. The cynicism was gone. The wall had come down. Thank you, Leo said. This time, his voice didn't crack. He walked the rest of the way to the double glass doors at the back of the hall. The room was buzzing with conversation now, but nobody was laughing. They were talking about the music. They were talking about him. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was dark, lit only by a single street lamp. The air was crisp and cold, biting at his face. But Leo didn't feel the cold. He felt a strange fire burning inside his chest. He looked at his hands. The greasy, scarred hand had just changed everything. He walked toward his old, battered car. It was still a piece of junk. It still needed a muffler. The stack of bills was still sitting on his kitchen table at home. The debt wasn't gone. The numbers were still real. But as he unlocked the car door and slid into the driver's seat, he realized that the weight was gone. Or at least, it was lighter. He had gone in there as a boy they wanted to throw away. He was leaving as a musician. He had reminded them that he was a human being. He had forced them to see him. And in doing so, he had remembered his own worth. He wasn't just a sum of money owed. He was Leo, and he had a song to sing. He started the engine. It coughed and sputtered, then roared to life. Leo sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was real. He put the car in gear and drove out of the parking lot, leaving the mocking laughter behind him in the dark, heading toward a future that suddenly seemed possible. The days that followed the meeting were different for Leo. It wasn't like a miracle movie where everything is fixed in an hour, but the heavy gray cloud that had been living over his head seemed to have thinned out. When he walked to his mailbox, he didn't feel the same crushing dread in his chest. He still had the bills. Those papers didn't magically disappear, but the way he carried himself had changed. He walked with his back a little straighter. He looked people in the eye. Nancy, the woman from a meeting, was true to her word. 2 days later, she knocked on his door with a keyboard. It wasn't a grand piano, and the keys were made of plastic that felt a little light under his fingers, but it worked. It had a headphone jack, which meant Leo could play in the middle of the night without waking the neighbors. For the first time in years, he had an outlet that was just for him. When the stress of the debt felt like it was choking him, he didn't have to suffer in silence. He could put on the headphones and play until the panic turned into music. Word traveled fast in a small neighborhood. The story of the boy who played the soul out of the old piano became the main topic of conversation at the grocery store and the barber shop. People who had ignored Leo for months were now waving at him from across the street. It was a strange feeling for him. He was used to being invisible or being seen as a nuisance. Now, he was a local celebrity of sorts. He wasn't the debtor anymore. He was the musician. A week later, Mr. Henderson came by the auto shop, where Leo worked wiping down floors and changing oil. The older man didn't come in for an oil change, though. He walked in with a toolbox in his hand and a look of determination on his face. "All right, kid," Mr. Henderson grunted, setting the heavy box down with a thud. "Pop the hood on that rust bucket of yours." Leo blinked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Mr. Henderson, what are you doing here? You said you needed extra hours to pay off the rent," the old man said, not looking at Leo but staring at the engine of Leo's car. "You can't get extra hours if your car won't start. I heard that clicking noise when you left the meeting the other night. Your starter is dead." Leo felt a flush of embarrassment. He knew the car was dying. He just didn't have the money to fix it. "I can't afford the part, sir. I'm barely scraping by as it is." "I didn't ask for your money," Mr. Henderson snapped, though his tone wasn't unkind. "I have a starter motor in my garage that's been sitting on a shelf for 10 years. It fits your make and model. I'm going to put it in. You're going to help me. Consider a trade." "A trade?" Leo asked. "I don't have anything to trade." "You're going to teach me how to play that song," Mr. Henderson said, looking Leo in the eye. "The one you played at the meeting. My wife, she passed away 2 years ago. That song reminded me of her. I want to learn it." Leo stared at him, stunned. The rough, mechanic man wanted to learn piano? "But I don't know how to teach. I just play by feeling." "Then teach me the feeling," Mr. Henderson said, already rolling up his sleeves and reaching for a wrench. "Come on, let's get this car running." For the next 3 hours, the two of them worked under the hood of the car. Mr. Henderson talked about engines the way Leo talked about music, seeing the beauty and how the parts fit together to make something run. He told Leo about his wife, about how quiet his house felt, and how he had forgotten that other people were struggling too. Leo listened, realizing that the man he had feared was just a lonely old man hurting in his own way. By the time the sun went down, the car was purring like a cat. It started on the first try. That weekend, Mrs. Gable knocked on Leo's door. She held a clipboard, but she wasn't frowning. She looked hesitant, almost shy. "Leo," she said, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, "I was talking to board. We looked at your account again." Leo felt his stomach tighten. "Here it comes. The eviction, after all. We decided to waive the late fees for this month," she said quickly, as if saying it fast made it easier. "And there is a space opening up at the community center for an instructor. We used to have a music teacher years ago, but the budget was cut. The parents are asking if anyone would be willing to teach beginner piano to the kids on Saturdays. It doesn't pay much, but it would help." Leo couldn't believe his ears. "An instructor? Him? You want me to teach?" "You have the gift, Leo," Mrs. Gable said softly, "and you have the patience. Anyone who can sit through that meeting without yelling back has patience. We need that. The kids need that." Saturday arrived, and Leo walked into Community Hall with his head held high. The dust on the piano had been wiped away. Someone had even polished the wood until it shined. There were 5 children sitting on small chairs in front of the stage, wiggling and bouncing with energy. Their parents stood in the back, watching. Leo sat down at the bench. He felt a little nervous, but then he looked at the kids. They weren't judging him. They weren't thinking about his debt. They were just waiting for the music to start. "Okay," Leo said, his voice clear and strong. "Today, we're not going to worry about reading the dots on the page. Today, we're going to learn how to make the piano sing." He placed his fingers on the keys and played a simple, happy melody. The children's faces lit up. They leaned forward, captivated. As he played, Leo looked into the back of the room. He saw Mr. Henderson standing there, arms crossed, nodding his head in time with the beat. He saw Nancy smiling. He saw the neighbors who had laughed at him, now standing with looks of pride on their faces. The music flowed out of him, lighter now than it had been that night. It was still full of emotion, but the heavy sorrow was lifting, replaced by a sense of hope. He realized that the debt wasn't the most important thing about him. The community wasn't his enemy. They were just people who had forgotten how to listen to each other. He had helped them remember. He played until the kids were clapping and cheering. When he finished, he didn't feel empty. He felt full. He stood up and bowed, just a little, to his students. The parents applauded. It was a small sound compared to a concert hall, but to Leo, it was louder than any applause in the world. As he packed up his things to leave, a young father came up to him. "Hey, Leo," the man said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. I heard about your situation from Mrs. Gable. I own the construction company down the road. We need someone to organize the warehouse in the evenings. It's not glamorous work, but it pays better than the garage. If you want it, it's yours." Leo looked at the man's hand, extended in friendship and offer. He thought about the stack of bills at home. They were still there, waiting for him. But for the first time, he knew he could beat them. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. "I'll take it," Leo said, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Thank you. Really." He walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The air didn't feel cold anymore. It felt crisp and clean. He looked at his car, which started immediately thanks to Mr. Henderson. He looked at the keyboard waiting for him in his apartment, thanks to Nancy. He thought about the job waiting for him thanks to this new, strange connection he had forged. The boy who was laughed at was gone. In his place was a man who had found his voice, and in finding it, he had given a voice to the whole neighborhood. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a chorus, and Leo was the one holding the baton. He got into his car and drove home, ready to face the numbers, knowing that as long as he had his hands and his heart, he would always be rich in ways that mattered. 6 months passed, and the calendar pages flipped faster than Leo ever expected. The stack of bills on his kitchen table didn't vanish overnight, but it got smaller. It turned from a terrifying mountain into a manageable hill. The envelope marked final notice that had once made his hands shake now just became something he opened, paid, and filed away. The eviction notice that had hung over his head like a dark cloud was replaced by a lease renewal, signed with a steady hand. The warehouse job was hard work. It involved heavy lifting, organizing dusty boxes, and long hours on his feet. But the pay was steady, and the boss, the young father from the meeting, treated him with respect. Leo didn't feel like a charity case there. He felt like a vital part of the team. He arrived early, stayed late, and used the rhythm of the work to clear his mind. When he was tired, he would hum the melodies he composed in his head, turning the clatter of the warehouse into a symphony of productivity. But the real change happened on Saturdays. Saturday became Leo's favorite day of the week. At 10 a.m. sharp, the doors of Community Hall would open, and a group of kids would rush in. They were different ages and sizes, some shy and some loud, but they all had one thing in common. They wanted to learn. Leo had started with 5 students, but now there were 15. Word had spread that the piano man could teach anyone how to make music, even if they couldn't read a note. Leo didn't teach them the rigid, boring way he had been taught a long time ago. He taught them to feel. He taught them that the low notes were angry bears and the high notes were birds. He taught them that music was a way to say the things they were too scared to speak out loud. One Saturday, a little girl named Timmy was struggling. She was trying to play a simple scale, but her fingers kept fumbling, and she burst into tears, frustrated. "I can't do it," she sobbed, slamming her small hands on the keys. "I'm just stupid. Everyone says so." Leo knelt down beside her bench, so he was looking her in the eye. He remembered the feeling of being not good enough. He remembered the laughter in the hall. "Hey, look at me," Leo said gently. "Do you know how many times I messed up when I was learning? Thousands. The people in this town used to laugh at me. They thought I was a failure because I didn't have any money." Timmy looked up, her eyes wide. "Really? But you play so good now." "I play good because I played through mistakes," Leo said. "Every time you hit a wrong note, it's just a step toward the right one. Don't apologize for the mistake. Just keep playing. The music doesn't judge you, Timmy. Only people do that. And the people who matter, they're listening to the song, not the mistakes." She sniffled, wiped her nose with her sleeve, and placed her hands back on the keys. She played the scale again. She missed one note, but she kept going without stopping. Leo beamed at her. That was the real lesson. In the back of the room, the parents watched. It wasn't just a drop-off service for them anymore. They stayed. They brought coffee. They sat in the plastic chairs and listened. Mr. Henderson was there every single week, sitting in the same spot he had sat in on that fateful night. He didn't play the piano. His fingers were too stiff with arthritis, but he listened. Sometimes he would bring donuts for the kids. He had become the unofficial grandfather of the class. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted completely. The gossip wasn't about who owed money anymore. It was about how proud everyone was of their piano teacher. The debt was old news, a forgotten ghost. The new story was about resilience. One evening, a few weeks before the holidays, the community hall was packed. It was the winter recital. The parents had brought decorations, strung up cheap tinsel, and baked cookies. The air smelled of sugar and wax. There was a buzz of excitement that you could feel as soon as you walked through the double glass doors. Leo stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone stand. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the people who had laughed at him. He saw the people who had judged him. He saw the people who had helped him. And they were all smiling. Not a fake polite smile, but a real one. "Thank you all for coming," Leo said into the mic. His voice didn't shake. "Tonight, you aren't going to hear professional musicians. You're going to hear brave ones. You're going to hear kids who face their fears." The kids played. Some were nervous. Some hit wrong notes. But every single one of them got a round of applause that shook the rafters. When Timmy played her piece, a simple but perfect melody, Mr. Henderson let out a loud bravo. That made everyone laugh and cheer. At the end of the night, Mrs. Gable walked up to the stage. She looked different without her clipboard. She held a simple piece of paper. "Leo," she said, turning to address the room as well as him, "we have something for you. The neighborhood collected this. It's not a handout. It's an investment." She handed him the paper. Leo looked down. It was a check. It wasn't enough to buy a mansion, but it was enough to clear the last of his medical debt. Completely. Leo stared at the numbers. He felt his throat tighten up. He looked out at the crowd. I can't take this," he stammered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Nancy called out from the crowd. "You already said it with your music. You gave us your heart, Leo. We're just giving you a fresh start." The room erupted in cheers and applause. It was louder than the laughter had been a year ago. It was warmer, too. It was the sound of a community healing. Leo walked over to the piano one last time that night. He sat down and looked at the keys. They were worn and familiar. He thought about the boy he used to be, the scared, lonely boy who sat in the corner while people mocked him. That boy felt like a stranger now. He placed his hands on the keys and played. He didn't play a sad song this time. He played a song that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was full of joy and gratitude. As he played, he watched the people talking and laughing. He saw Mr. Henderson helping Timmy reach a cookie. He saw his boss talking to Nancy. He saw a room full of people who were no longer strangers, but neighbors. The debt was gone. The shame was gone. But the music remained. It had saved him, yes, but it had also saved them. It had reminded them all that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and that kindness is the only currency that truly matters. As the last note faded into the warm, festive air, Leo stood up. He took a bow, not because he wanted praise, but because he was thankful. He was thankful for the struggle that led him here, and for the people who listened long enough to hear the song beneath the noise. He walked off the stage, not as a boy running away, but as a man walking forward into a life that was finally, beautifully his own.